When we speak about the empath, we often speak about tenderness, about openness, about the rare human being who feels the tremors in another's voice before a word is even spoken. But we rarely ask what it costs. We rarely ask what happens to the nervous system of the one who has been attuned to everyone else except themselves. And so today, we are not here to romanticize empathy. We are here to understand the moment when the empath, exhausted by overextension, misunderstood in their depth, finally becomes avoidant. Avoidance is not coldness. It is not cruelty. It is not a personality flaw. It is often the nervous system's last defense when connection has repeatedly meant pain. The empath does not withdraw because they do not care. They withdraw because they have cared too much for too long, without reciprocity, without safety, without being seen. When the empath finally becomes avoidant is not a story of transformation into something darker. It is a story of protection, of adaptation, of a heart that once stayed open at all costs, now learning, perhaps imperfectly, to close the gates. The nervous system of an empath is not simply sensitive, it is vigilant. From early life, many empaths learned that attunement was survival. To read the room was to stay safe. To anticipate another's mood was to prevent conflict. To soothe the others was to secure belonging. This is not a personality quirk. It is often an adaptation shaped by experience. When a child grows up in an environment where emotional unpredictability reigns, the body becomes exquisitely tuned to subtle cues. A shift in tone, a tightening of a jaw, a silence that lingers too long. The empath learns to detect these signals before conscious thought even arises. Over time, this hyper-attunement becomes identity. I am the one who understands. I am the one who holds space. I am the strong one, and the world rewards this role. People come with their wounds, their chaos, their unprocessed grief. The empath listens, absorbs, regulates, reassures. But what is rarely asked is who regulates the regulator. The human nervous system is not designed to chronically carry the emotional weight of others without rest or reciprocity. When the empath repeatedly overrides their own signals, fatigue, resentment, overwhelm, the body keeps score. The sympathetic system activates again and again. Stress hormones circulate, sleep becomes lighter, muscles remain braced. And yet outwardly, the empath may appear calm, present, supportive. Eventually, something shifts. The small irritations grow sharper. The once effortless listening feels heavy. The phone rings and instead of warmth, there is dread. Invitations feel like obligations. Conversations feel like extraction. The empath begins to notice that they are no longer replenished by connection, they are depleted by it. This is the beginning of withdrawal. But understand this clearly. The withdrawal is not random. It is not a calculated punishment. It is the body saying, enough. It is the nervous system recognizing that openness without boundaries has become unsustainable. When previous attempts to assert needs were dismissed, minimized, or met with guilt, the system learns a new strategy. If speaking up does not create safety, distance might. Avoidance in this context is a protective reflex. The empath stops sharing as deeply. They respond more slowly. They keep conversations surface level. They decline invitations. They may even cut ties abruptly. To the outside world, this can look cold, detached, even selfish. But internally, it often feels like survival. There is also grief here. The empath does not stop caring. They simply cannot afford the cost of caring in the same way anymore. Each interaction carries the memory of previous overextension. Each request for help echoes with the unspoken history of being the one who always showed up while their own needs went unseen. The nervous system, conditioned by repetition, anticipates depletion before it happens, and so it pulls back. In attachment language, we might say the empath shifts from anxious closeness to avoidant protection. But these labels are less important than the lived reality. The shift happens when the pain of staying open becomes greater than the fear of distance. The body recalibrates. Where it once leaned in, it now leans away. Where it once explained and over-explained, it now offers silence. Where it once tolerated imbalance, it now refuses engagement altogether. This is not a failure of character. It is an adaptation to chronic overwhelm. The same sensitivity that once made the empath deeply connected now makes them acutely aware of how much they have been carrying. And when that awareness reaches a threshold, the system chooses preservation. There may be guilt. Empaths are not comfortable with being the one who withdraws. They question themselves. Am I becoming heartless? Why don't I feel the same urgency to help? But beneath these questions is exhaustion. Years of emotional labor without adequate return create a deficit that cannot be ignored forever. Avoidance becomes a boundary when no other boundary felt safe enough to hold. It is imperfect. It can be rigid. It may block not only harm but also genuine connection. But in its essence, it is the psyche's attempt to restore equilibrium. The tragedy is that many empaths only learn about boundaries after they have already burned out. They swing from over-involvement to over-withdrawal, from self-abandonment to emotional isolation. The middle ground, compassion with limits, was never modeled for them. So the nervous system experiments, first with total openness, then with guarded distance. And in that guarded distance, the empath begins to encounter something unfamiliar: their own unmet needs. Without the constant distraction of others' crises, feelings surface: loneliness, anger, resentment, longing to be cared for without having to earn it through service. These emotions can feel overwhelming precisely because they were suppressed for so long. The avoidance, then, is not just about others. It is about making space to feel what was postponed. It is about redistributing energy inward. It is about the body reclaiming resources that were chronically outsourced. This turning point is uncomfortable. Relationships may fall away. Some people only knew the empath in their self-sacrificing role and do not recognize this new distance. But beneath the surface, something essential is happening. The nervous system is recalibrating its threshold for connection. It is asking, perhaps for the first time, is this safe for me too? Many empaths spend much of their lives absorbing energy, emotions, and needs from others without learning to define where they end and others begin. Boundaries are often taught too late, if at all, and by the time the empath recognizes the importance of saying no or protecting their space, the system has already been overwhelmed repeatedly. This keynote explores the subtle and cumulative ways overexposure to others' emotional turbulence creates a delayed awakening to the necessity of boundaries. It's the realization that caring indiscriminately has a cost, and that the cost often comes in the form of exhaustion, resentment, and emotional depletion. The empath may have grown up in environments where their sensitivity was praised superficially, but not truly supported. They learned to prioritize others' needs over their own, believing that love and connection were contingent on their willingness to give endlessly. Over time, this pattern reinforces a neural habit. Attunement becomes default. Self-protection becomes secondary. By the time they attempt to set limits, the nervous system may already be in a state of chronic stress, making the process feel risky, guilt-inducing, or even impossible. It's also crucial to understand that boundaries for empaths are not just about time or energy. They are about emotional and psychic safety. Saying no to a request or stepping away from a draining conversation is an act of preservation, not selfishness. Yet, because the empath has often been conditioned to feel responsible for others' feelings, these attempts at boundary setting are fraught with internal conflict. The delayed establishment of boundaries often leads to abrupt withdrawal later, which can seem harsh or confusing to those around them, but is in fact a corrective mechanism developed by the body and psyche. The empath journey toward healthy boundaries is rarely linear. It involves trial and error, self-reflection, and repeated practice in asserting needs without guilt. It also often requires the empath to relearn that it is acceptable to prioritize their well-being, and that maintaining emotional balance does not make them less compassionate. The avoidance behaviors that emerge later are frequently a direct consequence of boundaries coming too late. This keynote emphasizes that while late boundaries may appear reactive, they are fundamentally a sign of growth and survival. It is the body reclaiming authority over its own space and energy after years of unconscious surrender. It is the moment the empath transitions from people pleaser to self-aware protector, navigating the delicate terrain between openness and self-preservation. Would you like me to expand Keynote 2 into a full 750-word passage like I did with Keynote 1? Empaths are often celebrated for their capacity to feel deeply and care profoundly. Yet this very strength carries a hidden risk: compassion fatigue. Unlike ordinary exhaustion, compassion fatigue is a cumulative state of emotional depletion caused by sustained exposure to others' suffering, unrelieved by reciprocal care or support. For the empath, fatigue is rarely visible in the conventional sense. It hides behind calm expressions, soft voices, and an enduring willingness to be there for everyone else. Silence, in this context, is not apathy. It is a subtle signal that the system has reached its limit. This fatigue is insidious because empaths are trained, consciously or unconsciously, to ignore their own discomfort in favor of others. From childhood, many learn that emotional attunement is a responsibility, sometimes even a moral obligation. They become adept at absorbing the energy of their surroundings, regulating tense spaces, and soothing emotional storms, all while the strain accumulates silently in their own body and psyche. Over time, this creates a paradox. The empath is outwardly present and responsive, yet internally taxed, overwhelmed, and in need of reprieve. Compassion fatigue manifests in ways that can be difficult for both the empath and those around them to recognize. Subtle withdrawal, irritability, heightened sensitivity to minor slights, and the sense of being drained, even after restful periods, are common indicators. The empath may find themselves less able to respond with patience, less willing to engage in emotional labor, and more prone to feelings of cynicism or numbness. These signs are often misinterpreted as laziness, moodiness, or detachment, when in reality they are the nervous system's protective mechanisms. Silence becomes one of the primary coping strategies. When words fail to convey exhaustion, when overexertion has taught that expressing limits is met with resistance or guilt, the empath retreats inward. This quiet is not surrender, it is an unconscious self-preservation technique. In their silence, they conserve energy, shield themselves from additional emotional input, and attempt to restore equilibrium. Yet the withdrawal is often misread by others as coldness or distance, creating further tension and misunderstanding. Another layer of complexity is that compassion fatigue often develops gradually, making it difficult for empaths to pinpoint its onset. It creeps in through countless small sacrifices, repeated exposure to emotional distress, and the habitual neglect of personal needs. By the time the empath becomes consciously aware of it, the nervous system may already be signaling a shift toward avoidant behavior. This is the critical transition point where continued overexposure without boundaries triggers a protective withdrawal, what we see externally as the empath becoming avoidant. Addressing compassion fatigue requires intentional self-care and boundary setting, yet these measures can feel unfamiliar or even threatening to empaths accustomed to prioritizing others. Learning to recognize fatigue not as a weakness, but as a signal of the need for restoration is essential. It involves acknowledging personal limits, creating space for recovery, and cultivating supportive environments that respect their emotional bandwidth. This keynote highlights that the empath's silence, when born from compassion fatigue, is not a moral failing or a character flaw. It is a nuanced and vital expression of the body and mind saying, "I need a reprieve before I can continue to give." Understanding this dynamic allows both empaths and those around them to navigate relationships with greater awareness, empathy. Empaths are naturally wired to connect deeply, often developing anxious attachment patterns early in life. They seek closeness, reassurance, and emotional reciprocity, and they are highly attuned to signs of acceptance or rejection from others. In these patterns, the empath's sense of security is inextricably linked to the presence and validation of others. Their nervous system constantly scans for cues of connection, approval, or potential abandonment, making them extraordinarily sensitive to relational dynamics. Over time, repeated experiences of overextension, unmet needs, or emotional exploitation can trigger a profound internal shift. The empath begins to learn, often unconsciously, that relying on others for emotional validation comes at a cost. Their deep sensitivity, which once facilitated connection, now exposes them to vulnerability, hurt, and fatigue. In response, the nervous system may gradually pivot from an anxious attachment style, marked by pursuit, worry, and hypervigilance, to a more avoidant stance, characterized by withdrawal, distance, and self-protective detachment. This shift is not sudden. It is a process that occurs through repeated cycles of engagement and depletion. Each time the empath extends themselves without adequate reciprocation, their nervous system stores the memory of overexertion. Subtle physical and emotional signals, tension in the chest, a sense of heaviness, irritability, or internal resistance, begin to arise before conscious thought even registers the need for self-protection. Over time, these signals consolidate into an avoidant pattern, where the empath preemptively distances themselves to prevent further exhaustion or emotional harm. Avoidant protection is often misinterpreted by others as coldness, detachment, or a lack of care. Yet beneath the surface, it is deeply relational. It is the empath's way of managing risk and preserving capacity to engage meaningfully when they choose. They have learned that the cost of anxious pursuit, hypervigilance, emotional overinvestment, and depletion is unsustainable. Withdrawal becomes a sophisticated survival strategy, allowing them to recalibrate and restore emotional energy while minimizing the likelihood of further harm. This transition also represents a recalibration of boundaries, where anxious attachment prompts the empath to override their own needs in favor of maintaining connection. The avoidant shift enforces limits, both overt and subtle. Social invitations may be declined, conversations may be shortened, and emotional disclosures may be restrained. The empath's external behavior changes, but the internal motivation is not indifference, it is preservation. They are learning to honor their own limits and protect their sensitive nervous system from relentless stimulation. The shift from anxious attachment to avoidant protection also reveals the empath's growing awareness of self-worth and self-preservation. Whereas previously they may have believed that love and acceptance were conditional upon constant giving, the avoidant phase allows them to begin testing the principle that they are deserving of care and respect without sacrificing themselves. It is important to recognize that this avoidant protection is often temporary and situational. It emerges as a response to perceived threats of depletion and overstimulation, and it is a corrective mechanism rather than a fixed personality change. With conscious reflection, healthy boundaries, and supportive relationships, the empath can integrate their sensitivity with a balanced approach to connection, one that allows deep engagement without compromising their well-being. This keynote illuminates the complex psychological and physiological processes behind the empath's withdrawal, showing that avoidance is not a failure of empathy, but a sophisticated adaptation. It is the nervous system asserting its right to survival, the psyche insisting on respect for its limits, and the heart gradually learning that true compassion must begin with oneself. Do you want me to continue and expand Keynote 5 next? For empaths, emotional burnout is often invisible even to themselves until it reaches a critical point. Unlike physical exhaustion, which manifests clearly in fatigue, aching muscles, or lethargy, emotional burnout accumulates subtly within the nervous system. It creeps in through repeated exposure to the emotions, stressors, and demands of others, often without adequate rest, support, or validation. Over time, the empath's natural generosity of spirit begins to erode, leaving behind an outward appearance of indifference or detachment. This seeming indifference is misleading. It is not that the empath no longer cares, but that their capacity to care has been temporarily exceeded. They have absorbed so much emotional weight, regulated so many crises, and held so many unprocessed energies of others that their own system has reached its saturation point. In this state, emotional responses become muted. Empathy feels heavier than it should, and the act of connecting deeply triggers tension instead of fulfillment. The early stages of this burnout are often subtle. The empath may notice that interactions which once brought joy now feel draining, that conversations require more effort than before, or that they feel irritable or impatient with loved ones. They may experience a sense of detachment, as though they are observing life rather than participating in it fully. Others may misinterpret this as aloofness, selfishness, or a personality shift, when in reality it is a protective adaptation of a system pushed to its limits. Burnout develops because empaths tend to prioritize others' needs above their own. They give endlessly, emotional energy, time, attention, and care, without replenishing their own reserves. The nervous system, designed to respond to stress with balance, eventually signals that it cannot continue in the same way. If the empath continues to ignore these signals, the body begins to enforce withdrawal, sometimes abruptly, sometimes in subtle ways, to prevent total collapse. This is the body's version of saying, enough is enough. Indifference is a mask, a coping strategy that allows the empath to navigate social or relational demands without further depletion. By appearing less responsive, less available, or emotionally neutral, they conserve energy and create psychological space to recover. Yet this self-protective stance can be misread when in fact it is the only available mechanism to maintain equilibrium. Recovery from emotional burnout requires recognition and intentional action. The empath must first acknowledge that their fatigue is valid and not a sign of moral or personal failure. They must practice self-compassion, prioritize rest, and establish boundaries that protect their nervous system from further strain. This process often involves difficult choices, saying no to demands, to process accumulated stress and rebuild resilience. Emotional burnout masquerading as indifference is a critical turning point in the empath's journey. It signals that patterns of overextension are unsustainable and that the nervous system must be respected. Understanding this allows both the empath and those around them to interpret withdrawal not as rejection, but as a necessary pause for self-preservation. It is a moment of recalibration, a reminder that empathy without boundaries is unsustainable, and that caring for oneself is an essential part of the capacity to care for others. This keynote underscores the delicate balance empaths must navigate between openness and preservation. Burnout is not failure, it is the body and mind asserting limits, often in ways that may seem counterintuitive or misunderstood. Recognizing the signs early and responding with conscious strategies is what transforms apparent indifference into intentional self-care, allowing the empath to eventually re-engage from a place of strength and equilibrium. For the empath who has experienced repeated overextension, a deep-seated fear begins to take root, the fear of being drained again. This is not a superficial worry or simple hesitation. It is a profound, almost instinctual protective response arising from the nervous system's memory of past depletion. Every interaction request or emotional demand carries the echo of previous experiences, times when giving too much led to exhaustion, resentment, or a sense of invisibility. The empath becomes acutely aware of the potential cost of connection, and the anticipation of being drained again triggers both conscious and unconscious withdrawal. This fear is both psychological and physiological. Psychologically, the empath may rehearse past scenarios, recalling moments when boundaries were ignored, when generosity was exploited, or when their efforts to help were met with indifference or ingratitude. These memories create a heightened vigilance, a mental and emotional risk assessment, before engaging in new interactions. Physiologically, the nervous system reacts preemptively, muscles tighten, heart rate may increase, cortisol levels rise, and subtle signals of anxiety or dread emerge even before a conversation begins. It is the body's way of signaling, protect yourself, do not repeat the same exhaustion. The fear of being drained is often compounded by guilt. Empaths may struggle with the idea that self-preservation is selfish, or that refusing to help will harm relationships. This internal conflict can create tension, the desire to maintain compassion and connection versus the need to safeguard energy and emotional well-being. The empath may oscillate between engaging and retreating, carefully monitoring interactions to determine whether the other party is safe to connect with, whether boundaries will be respected, or whether the emotional cost will outweigh the benefit. This fear also reinforces the shift toward avoidant behavior. By withdrawing preemptively, the empath reduces exposure to potential harm. Invitations may be declined, conversations kept brief, emotional sharing minimized. Outwardly, these actions can appear cold or disengaged, but internally they represent calculated strategies for self-preservation. The empath is learning to listen to the subtle signals of their body and nervous system, honoring the limits that were previously ignored. Importantly, this fear is adaptive rather than pathological. It is the nervous system's way of ensuring survival and maintaining equilibrium after repeated overstimulation. Without this vigilance, the empath risks repeating cycles of overexertion that lead to emotional burnout and exhaustion. Over time, however, if left unchecked or unsupported, the fear can become rigid, leading to excessive isolation, mistrust, or emotional withdrawal that limits genuine connection. Healing this fear involves a delicate balance of self-awareness, boundary setting, and conscious engagement. The empath must learn to distinguish between real threats to their energy and opportunities for safe, reciprocal connection. They must develop strategies to replenish themselves, seek supportive environments, and cultivate relationships that honor mutual care. By doing so, the empath transforms fear from a reactive, protective force into an informed guide for navigating relationships without compromising their well-being. This keynote highlights that avoidance is not a sign of weakness or detachment, but an evolved mechanism for protecting the empath's emotional and physical energy. It is the nervous system insisting on respect for limits, and the mind recognizing the consequences of repeated depletion. Understanding this dynamic allows the empath to approach life with discernment, preserving their capacity to give and connect, while safeguarding their own health and vitality. For the empath, reaching the stage where self-preservation becomes a priority is both a crisis and a revelation. It is a sacred turning point, one that often comes after years of overextension, repeated disappointment, and emotional depletion. This is the moment when the empath begins to understand that their ability to care for others is intrinsically linked to their ability to care for themselves. It is not selfishness, it is recognition that the body, mind, and spirit cannot sustain endless giving without being replenished. Self-preservation emerges from the quiet, persistent signals of the nervous system. The empath may notice subtle tensions, a constant sense of fatigue, irritability, or a creeping emotional numbness. They may feel dread before social interactions, experience heightened anxiety when faced with others' demands, or recognize patterns of resentment that have silently accumulated over time. These signals are the body's way of communicating, often more clearly than conscious thought, that boundaries must be established and energy protected. At this turning point, avoidance becomes a conscious or semi-conscious tool of preservation. The empath begins to say no more often, to withdraw from draining relationships, and to create space for restoration. These actions may be abrupt or gradual, but they are rooted in a deep wisdom. Connection without safety, care without reciprocity, and empathy without replenishment is unsustainable. The nervous system, once hyper-alert to others' needs, now turns inward, demanding attention and respect for the empath's own well-being. This stage is also transformative in terms of identity and self-perception. Empaths who have long defined themselves by their service to others begin to reevaluate what it means to be compassionate. They discover that empathy is not measured by constant availability or sacrifice, but by the integrity of presence, being able to give without losing oneself. Self-preservation does not negate empathy, it refines it, aligning it with boundaries that allow for sustainable connection. However, this shift is rarely easy or free of emotional conflict. Many empaths experience guilt, questioning whether they are abandoning others or failing in their responsibilities. They may struggle with cultural or familial conditioning that equates giving with love or moral worth. But through reflection, support, and practice, the empath learns to reinterpret these feelings. Boundaries, distance, and selective engagement become sacred acts of honoring both self and others, ensuring that when they do give, they give from fullness rather than depletion. This turning point often coincides with a reevaluation of relationships and environments. Empaths begin to recognize which connections are reciprocal, supportive, and nourishing versus those that are draining or exploitative. Avoidance in these contexts is not punitive, it is a discerning, protective measure that safeguards emotional energy and nurtures resilience. The empath's withdrawal is a declaration: my capacity to care is precious, and it will be honored. Self-preservation is the threshold where avoidance transforms from a defensive reaction into a conscious, sacred practice. It signals maturity in emotional regulation, integration of nervous system cues, and the understanding that sustainable empathy requires balance. This stage marks the evolution from reactive giving to intentional engagement, where the empath can navigate life with clarity, presence, and resilience. This keynote illuminates that avoidance is not a failure or flaw, but a milestone in the empath's journey. It is the nervous system, mind, and spirit converging to teach the profound lesson that caring deeply for oneself is not just necessary, it is sacred. The final keynote explores the profound transformation that occurs when the empath learns to reclaim their gift of empathy without sacrificing their own well-being. For much of their life, the empath may have equated caring deeply with self-abandonment, believing that to be compassionate meant to give endlessly, to absorb endlessly, and to prioritize others' emotional needs above their own. This mindset, though often well-intentioned, leads to chronic depletion, emotional fatigue, and, eventually, the withdrawal patterns we have been exploring. The journey to reclaiming empathy is not about shutting off the heart, it is about recalibrating it, integrating wisdom, boundaries, and discernment into the very act of connection. Reclaiming empathy begins with awareness. The empath must first recognize the patterns of overextension and the ways in which their sensitivity has been exploited or mismanaged. This awareness is both liberating and challenging. It forces confrontation with uncomfortable truths, relationships that are draining rather than nurturing, habitual people, pleasing behaviors, and internalized guilt that has long dictated their interactions. Awareness is the spark that allows the empath to differentiate between connection that sustains them and connection that depletes them. Once awareness is established, boundaries become the next essential step. Healthy boundaries are the framework through which empathy can be expressed sustainably. This may include learning to say no, limiting exposure to emotionally toxic environments, or cultivating relationships that honor mutual respect and care. The empath discovers that boundaries are not walls. They are gates that protect energy while still allowing for authentic engagement. It is through these boundaries that empathy can flourish without self-sacrifice. Another critical component is the cultivation of self-nurturing practices. Reclaiming empathy requires replenishment, both emotional and physical. Meditation, journaling, quiet reflection, and spending time in restorative environments are tools that enable the empath to reconnect with their inner self. By replenishing their own reserves, empaths ensure that their capacity to give does not come at the expense of their own health. They learn that empathy is most powerful when it is offered from a place of abundance rather than deficit. Reclaiming empathy also involves discernment in relationship choices. The empath begins to recognize patterns in people and situations that previously drained them. They learn to prioritize connections with those who respect their boundaries, honor their energy, and reciprocate care. This does not mean abandoning compassion for those in need. Rather, it means engaging with clarity, intention, and sustainability. Empathy becomes a conscious practice rather than an automatic response, allowing the empath to choose how and where to invest their emotional energy. This transformation often brings profound emotional liberation. The empath no longer experiences the guilt or anxiety associated with saying no or stepping back. They feel empowered to engage authentically, without fear of depletion or resentment. The act of caring is no longer synonymous with self-loss. It is a balanced exchange, rooted in awareness, respect, and mutual benefit. Ultimately, reclaiming empathy without self-abandonment is a reclamation of agency, dignity, and personal power. The empath learns that their sensitivity is not a liability but a gift that can be expressed wisely. Avoidance, when it arises, is understood not as failure but as a signal from the nervous system, a reminder to honor limits and practice self-care. Through this process, the empath can navigate life with depth, resilience, and authenticity, fully present for others while fully present for themselves. This keynote completes the arc of understanding the avoidance stage from exhaustion and withdrawal to conscious self-preservation, culminating in a sustainable, empowered form of empathy that honors both self and others.